Daniel Cooper stood in the observation deck of Zenith Prime Station and watched the stars with tired eyes. He had been a diplomat for 30 years and thought he had seen every kind of lie and deception that sentient beings could offer. He was wrong. The holographic display behind him showed images that made his blood run cold. 3 human colonies had been destroyed in a single coordinated strike. New Haven, with its population of 24,000 farmers and miners, was gone. Liberty Point, where 15,000 people had built a new life among the Red Mountains, was nothing but ash and melted metal. Green Valley Station, with its 34,000 souls including 8,000 children, was now a graveyard floating in the silence of space. The Velkari Dominion had done this. The same species that had signed a peace treaty with humanity 20 years ago. The same government that had shaken hands with human ambassadors and promised eternal friendship. The same military force that humanity had trusted enough to allow near their borders. Daniel had been part of the team that negotiated that treaty. He had spent 2 years of his life going back and forth between Earth and the Velkari homeworld. He had learned their language and their customs. He had eaten their food and attended their ceremonies. He had believed in the peace they were building together. Commander Lisa Grant entered the observation deck carrying a data tablet. Her uniform was crisp and perfect as always, but her eyes showed the same exhaustion that Daniel felt. She had been reviewing the tactical data from the attacks for the past 18 hours without sleep. Lisa was the kind of officer who needed to understand every detail before she could accept what had happened. Daniel understood that need. They both wanted to find some explanation that would make sense of the senseless. She stopped beside him, and they both stared out at the stars for a long moment, before either spoke. The station around them was busy with the sounds of crew members and other species, going about their daily routines. None of them knew yet what had happened on the frontier. The news was being carefully controlled until humanity decided how to respond. That decision would come soon. Daniel knew it would come from him. Lisa finally broke the silence. Her voice was steady, but Daniel could hear the anger underneath each word. She told him that the Velkari were calling it an accident. Their official statement claimed that a military exercise had gone wrong. 3 of their warships had somehow fired on civilian targets by mistake. They were deeply sorry for the loss of life. They were offering reparations of 10 million galactic credits to be distributed among the families of the deceased. Daniel turned to look at her. He asked if she believed it was an accident. Lisa met his eyes and slowly shook her head. She had reviewed the tactical data a dozen times. The Velkari warships had jumped into each system simultaneously. They had targeted the main population centers first. They had destroyed the communication arrays before firing on residential areas. They had made sure no distress signals could be sent until it was too late. Every action showed planning and coordination. This was no accident. This was murder. Daniel nodded slowly. He had expected that answer, but hearing it confirmed made something settle in his chest. A decision that had been forming for days finally crystallized into certainty. He asked Lisa how long it would take to mobilize the fleet. She looked surprised by the question. They were diplomats and military advisors stationed on a neutral space station. They had no authority to mobilize anything. That kind of decision came from Earth Command and the Civilian Council. But Daniel had already sent his recommendations to Earth 3 days ago. He had anticipated this moment. When intelligence reports first suggested that the Velkari were planning something, he had quietly begun preparing. He had contacted old friends in the military. He had reviewed deployment schedules and supply lines. He had made sure that certain ships were positioned in certain places at certain times, just in case. Just in case the piece he had spent years building turned out to be built on sand. Lisa checked her tablet and her eyes widened slightly. She told him that 12 carrier groups were already in position around Velkari space. They had been moving into place for the past 3 weeks under the guise of routine patrol rotations. Daniel had orchestrated it all. He had hoped desperately that he was wrong, that the intelligence was mistaken, that the Velkari would prove him a paranoid fool. But he had been right. And now 73,000 human beings were dead because he had not acted soon enough. He told Lisa to prepare a message for the Galactic Council. They would convene an emergency session within 24 hours. Humanity would present evidence of the Velkari attack. They would demand justice, and if the Council could not provide it, humanity would provide its own. Lisa asked what he meant by that. Her voice was careful. She knew Daniel well enough to understand that he was not speaking in hypotheticals. Daniel turned back to the window. Out there in the darkness, human warships were taking up positions around every major Velkari world. Captains were reviewing battle plans. Pilots were running combat simulations. Marines were checking their weapons and armor. The entire apparatus of human military power was winding up like a spring. All it needed was his word to release. He told Lisa that humanity had tried to join the galactic community as peaceful partners. They had accepted unfavorable treaty terms to prove their good intentions. They had traded away valuable resources to build trust. They had limited their own military expansion to avoid seeming aggressive. And in return, the Velkari had waited until they thought humanity was weak and complacent. Then they had struck at defenseless civilians. They had killed children. They had burned homes. They had thought humanity would accept some money and move on like this was just the cost of doing business in space. Daniel's reflection in the window showed a face that looked older than his 55 years. He said quietly that the Velkari were about to learn something that humanity had known for centuries. That kindness was not weakness. That patience was not cowardice. That the willingness to talk before fighting did not mean the inability to fight when talking failed. Humanity had been fighting wars for thousands of years before they reached the stars. They had refined the art of violence to a degree that the galactic community could not comprehend, because most species had never needed to become so good at it. Lisa stood beside him in silence. She had served with Daniel long enough to know that he did not make threats he could not back up. She had also served in enough combat zones to know what was coming. The Velkari had started something they did not understand. They had broken a treaty with the one species in the galaxy that took treaties seriously, because they understood exactly what happened when treaties failed. When diplomacy ended, war began, and humanity was very, very good at war. Daniel told her to send the message to the council. They would convene tomorrow. The Velkari would be given one chance to surrender those responsible and submit to justice, one chance to avoid what was coming. He did not expect them to take it. Species that murdered civilians were rarely wise enough to accept accountability, but humanity would offer the chance anyway, because that was what civilized people did. They followed the rules right up until the moment that following the rules meant letting murderers go free. Lisa left to send the message. Daniel remained at the window watching the stars. Somewhere out there in the darkness, 73,000 ghosts were waiting for justice. He would not fail them. The Galactic Council chamber was built to impress and intimidate in equal measure. 43 species had representatives seated in curved rows that rose up toward a domed ceiling, painted with stars. Each delegation had its own section with specialized atmosphere controls and gravity adjustments. The Velkari delegation sat in the upper left section where the temperature was kept cool and the air was thin. Ambassador Korath preened his crystalline feathers and spoke quietly with his aides. He looked confident and relaxed. He had no reason to think this session would be any different from the hundreds of others he had attended over his long career. Daniel Cooper walked into the chamber with Lisa Grant at his side. He carried no notes and no data tablets. Everything he needed was already loaded into the chamber's central display system. He had spent the previous night reviewing the evidence one more time, making sure every detail was correct, making absolutely certain that what he was about to do was justified. The faces of 73,000 dead people had stared at him from his quarters wall until dawn. Their deaths demanded more than words, but words were where justice had to start. The council chairman called the session to order. He was a Valorian named Krath who had held the position for 15 cycles. His species resembled large floating jellyfish with bioluminescent patterns that indicated emotion. Right now his patterns showed calm blue and green. That would change soon. Krath asked Daniel to present the human petition. His tone suggested he expected this to be routine. A complaint about trade routes or mining rights, something that could be handled with a few compromises and a scheduled follow-up meeting. Daniel activated the central display. The holographic projector filled the space above the council floor with images from New Haven Colony. Buildings that had been homes and schools and hospitals were now just slay. And the agricultural domes that had fed 24,000 people were shattered and open to vacuum. Bodies floated in the debris field. Some of them were so small they could only be children. The council chamber fell silent. Even species that had seen war before were shocked by the totality of the destruction. Daniel let the images speak for themselves for a full minute. Then he switched to Liberty Point. The red mountains that colonists had loved were now scorched black. The mining facilities were gone. The residential complexes were gone. Everything was gone. He showed them Green Valley Station. He showed them the school that had held 3,000 students. He showed them the hospital. He showed them the parks where families had gathered. All of it was reduced to wreckage and corpses. Korath stood up in his section. His translator rendered his clicking speech into common language. He began to speak about the tragic accident that had occurred. He expressed deep regret. He mentioned the reparations that the Velkari Dominion was prepared to offer. He spoke for 3 minutes using all the diplomatic phrases that were designed to sound meaningful, while saying nothing at all. Daniel waited until Korath finished. Then he activated another display. This one showed tactical data, trajectory plots, timestamps, communication intercepts. The Velkari warships had jumped into all 3 systems within a 10-second window. They had targeted population centers with their opening salvos. They had jammed all communications. They had followed attack patterns that were used for assaulting military installations, not civilian colonies. Every piece of data pointed to the same conclusion. This was planned. This was coordinated. This was intentional. He spoke in a voice that was calm and cold. He told the Council that the Velkari Dominion had violated Articles 3, 7, and 12 of the Galactic Peace Accords. They had attacked civilian targets. They had murdered non-combatants. They had done so deliberately and with full knowledge of what they were doing. The evidence was overwhelming. The guilt was absolute. The only question now was what justice looked like. Korath's feathers ruffled in agitation. He insisted it was an accident, a terrible mistake made during a military exercise. He raised his voice and demanded that the Council not be swayed by human emotionalism. 10 million credits was a generous offer. More than generous. The humans should accept it and move forward. Daniel turned to look directly at Korath. He said that humanity did not want Velkari money. They wanted accountability. They wanted the commanders who ordered the attack to face trial. They wanted monitoring stations in Velkari space to prevent future attacks. They wanted the Velkari fleet reduced to defensive levels only. And if the Velkari refused these terms, humanity would enforce them. The council chamber erupted. Representatives from a dozen species began speaking at once. Some demanded order. Some questioned whether humanity had the right to make such demands. Some asked what enforcement meant. Krath's bioluminescent patterns flashed red and orange, showing distress and confusion. He tried to restore order, but the chamber remained chaotic. A representative from the Thaxian collective asked the obvious question. How did humanity plan to enforce anything against the Velkari Dominion? The Velkari had one of the largest fleets in the galaxy, 600 warships. Humanity was a young species with limited military power. They had perhaps 200 ships capable of deep space combat. The mathematics were simple. Humanity was outnumbered and outgunned. Their threats were empty. Lisa Grant stepped forward and activated her own data tablet. The central display changed to show current fleet positions. 12 human carrier groups surrounded every major Velkari world. Each group contained between 15 and 20 warships plus support vessels. The deployments were perfect, too perfect to have been arranged quickly. The humans had been planning this for weeks. They had anticipated the attack. They had prepared their response. And now they had the Velkari surrounded. Korath stared at the display. His confident demeanor cracked. He demanded to know when human ships had been authorized to enter Velkari space. Daniel replied that they had not entered Velkari space. They were positioned in neutral zones just outside Velkari territorial boundaries, perfectly legal under galactic law, but close enough to strike at any moment. The Thaxian representative pointed out that humanity was still outnumbered 3-1. The Velkari could easily defeat such a small force. Daniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He said that numbers were not everything. Humanity had spent 10,000 years fighting wars on Earth. They had refined tactics and strategies through countless conflicts. They had learned hard lessons about what worked and what failed. The Velkari had no such experience. Their last major conflict had been 400 years ago. Their military doctrine was outdated. Their commanders were trained in theory, not practice. Another species representative asked if Daniel was seriously suggesting that humanity could defeat the Velkari in open combat. Daniel said he was not suggesting anything. He was stating a fact. If the Velkari chose to fight, humanity would destroy their military capability completely. Not defeat it, not damage it, destroy it, remove it as a threat forever. The human fleet had orders and authorization to do exactly that if negotiations failed. Korath stood again. His translator made his voice sound steady, but his feathers were fluffed in a pattern that Lisa recognized as fear. He said that threatening council members was forbidden, that humanity would be censured, that other species would unite against such aggression. Daniel listened to this speech with no expression on his face. When Korath finished, Daniel spoke again. He reminded the council that humanity had not fired a single shot. They had not crossed any borders. They had not violated any laws. They had simply positioned their forces in international space and made an offer. The Velkari could accept justice peacefully or they could face it by force. The choice was entirely theirs. Krath called for a recess. The council needed time to discuss this unprecedented situation. Representatives from dozens of species began talking among themselves. Some looked frightened, some looked angry, some looked calculating as they wondered what this meant for the balance of power in the galaxy. Humanity had been seen as a minor player, a young species still learning how things worked. Now they were demonstrating that they understood exactly how things worked, and they were prepared to change the rules if those rules protected murderers. Daniel and Lisa left the chamber. Behind them, the council dissolved into chaos. Arguments broke out between species that had been allies for centuries. Accusations were thrown. Alliances were questioned. Everything that the council had built over generations was suddenly uncertain because one species had broken a treaty and another species was refusing to let it slide. Lisa asked Daniel if he thought the Velkari would surrender the commanders. Daniel said he doubted it. Species that committed war crimes rarely had the courage to face consequences, but he had given them the chance. That was important. When historians looked back at this moment, they would see that humanity had followed every rule, had exhausted every peaceful option, had done everything the civilized galaxy demanded before resorting to force. And when force came, it would be absolute. Korath returned to his quarters on Zenith Prime Station and immediately contacted the Velkari High Command. His hand shook as he activated the secure communication channel. The holographic image of Grand Marshal Vekthar appeared before him. Vekthar was old even by Velkari standards. His crystalline feathers had faded to a dull gray, and his eyes held the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. He asked Korath why he was disturbing the High Command with trivial diplomatic matters. Korath explained what had happened in the council chamber. He told Vekthar about the human ultimatum, about the fleet positions, about the demands for surrender and trials. Vekthar listened without interruption. When Korath finished, the Grand Marshal laughed. It was a harsh clicking sound that the translator rendered as contempt. Vekthar said that the humans were bluffing. They had to be. No species would risk war over a few lost colonies, certainly not against an opponent with 3 times their numbers. The Grand Marshal told Korath to ignore the human threats, to stall in the council, to make counteroffers that sounded reasonable but gave up nothing important. This was standard diplomatic theater. Within a week, the humans would accept some token gesture and everyone would move on. The Velkari had played this game with dozens of species over the centuries. The humans were no different. They would rage and threaten, and then they would calculate the cost of war and decide that peace was cheaper. Korath wanted to believe that. He tried to believe it, but something in Daniel Cooper's eyes had frightened him in a way he could not explain to his superior. The human diplomat had not looked angry. Angry opponents could be negotiated with. Daniel had looked patient, like a teacher waiting for a slow student to understand a simple lesson. That patience was somehow more terrifying than rage would have been. Captain Helen Morris stood on the bridge of the carrier Defiant and reviewed the tactical displays. Her ship was part of Battle Group 7, positioned near the Velkari homeworld. 11 other battle groups were scattered across as Velkari territory in similar positions. Each group had a specific target list. Each captain knew exactly what to do when the order came. If the order came, Helen hoped it would not. She had seen enough war in her career, but if it came, she would execute her duty with the precision that humanity demanded. Her tactical officer was a young woman named Kelly Price. Kelly had graduated top of her class at the academy 3 years ago, and this was her first major deployment. She asked Helen if she thought the Velkari would actually fight. Helen considered the question carefully. She told Kelly that the Valkyrie would fight because they could not imagine losing. They had been the dominant military power in this sector for 400 years. They had the numbers and the firepower and the territorial advantage. On paper, they should win easily. But wars were not fought on paper. Kelly asked what made human tactics different. Why Command believed that 200 ships could defeat 600. Helen pulled up a historical file on her personal screen. She showed Kelly footage from Earth's 20th century, battles where smaller forces had defeated larger ones through superior tactics and technology. She explained that most galactic species fought wars the way nobility once fought duels, with honor and rules and predictable patterns. Humanity had learned to fight wars with the singular goal of winning no matter what it took. The Valkyrie fleet began mobilizing 12 hours after the council session. 600 warships across 24 systems started moving toward defensive positions around their core worlds. It was an impressive display of military power. Grand Marshal Vector himself took command of the primary fleet defending the homeworld. 200 Valkyrie warships gathered in a defensive sphere around their most important planet. The formation was textbook perfect. It had been used successfully in every major conflict the Valkyrie had fought. Daniel watched the Valkyrie fleet movements from his quarters on Zenith Prime. Lisa brought him regular updates from intelligence sources. The Valkyrie were doing exactly what human analysts had predicted. They were forming up in traditional defensive formations. They were positioning their strongest ships at the front. They were preparing for the kind of battle they understood. A slow, methodical engagement where both sides would exchange fire until one side's morale broke and they retreated. Daniel sent a final message to Earth Command. The Valkyrie had refused the ultimatum. They had not surrendered the commanders responsible for the colony attacks. They had not agreed to monitoring or fleet reductions. They had instead mobilized for war. The choice had been made, not by humanity but by the Valkyrie themselves. Now humanity would respond with the full weight of its military capability. The authorization came back within an hour. Earth's civilian government and military command were in complete agreement. The Valkyrie had committed an act of war. They had murdered human civilians. They had violated a peace treaty. They had rejected reasonable demands for justice. Therefore, humanity was authorized to use all necessary force to achieve its objectives. Those objectives were simple: destroy the Valkyrie military capability, ensure they could never threaten human colonies again, make an example that would be remembered by every species in the galaxy. Helen Morris received her orders at 600 station time. The attack would begin at 800. Her battle group would strike the Valkyrie homeworld defense fleet. 9 other battle groups would hit targets across Valkyrie space simultaneously. 2 groups would remain in reserve. The coordination required was enormous. Ships separated by dozens of light years would need to attack at exactly the same moment. It was the kind of operation that most species could not even attempt. But humanity had been coordinating complex military operations since before they left Earth. They had systems and procedures and technologies that other species had never needed to develop. The humans did not fight wars for honor or territory. They fought to win, and that meant planning everything down to the smallest detail. Kelly Price checked her tactical board for the 100th time. Everything was ready. Weapons were charged. Shields were calibrated. Crews were at battle stations. Around her, the bridge crew worked with calm efficiency. Nobody was shouting or panicking. They were professionals doing a job they had trained years to do. Kelly felt her heart racing, but she kept her hands steady on the controls. Helen addressed her crew over the ship-wide channel. She told them that they were about to engage an enemy that outnumbered them significantly, that many of them might not survive the next few hours, but they were fighting for a righteous cause. The Valkyrie had murdered children. They had destroyed homes. They had broken every rule that civilized beings were supposed to follow. Today, humanity would remind the galaxy why those rules existed and what happened to those who broke them. Across human space, families gathered to watch news broadcasts. The government had not hidden what was happening. Citizens knew that their military was about to engage the Valkyrie, knew that casualties were likely, but the footage from the destroyed colonies had been released. Everyone had seen the bodies, the burned schools, the shattered hospitals. There was no dissent, no protests. Humanity was united in a way they had not been since the early days of space exploration. Daniel stood alone in the observation deck and watched the clock count down. In 30 minutes, the attack would begin. In 30 minutes, the galaxy would learn what humanity was capable of when pushed beyond patience. He thought about all the speeches he had given about peace, all the treaties he had negotiated, all the compromises he had made to avoid conflict. None of it had mattered. The Velkhari had seen kindness as weakness. The clock reached zero. Across dozens of star systems, human warships began their attack runs. The Battle of Velkhari Prime was about to begin. It would last 4 hours. When it ended, the balance of power in the galaxy would be forever changed. Not because humanity wanted power, but because they had proven they could take it whenever they chose. Helen gave the order to advance. The Defiant and its battle group accelerated toward the Velkhari defensive sphere. The enemy ships detected them immediately and began moving to intercept. 200 Velkhari warships against 18 human vessels. The odds looked impossible. Grand Marshal Vekthar watched the human approach from his command ship and smiled. These foolish young species were about to learn why the Velkhari had ruled this sector for centuries. He had no idea that in 4 hours his entire fleet would be debris and his government would be begging for mercy. The first missiles launched from the Defiant at maximum range. The Velkhari defensive sphere detected them immediately and activated countermeasures. Point defense systems tracked the incoming projectiles and began firing. Dozens of missiles were destroyed in the opening seconds. The Velkhari formation held steady. This was exactly what they expected. The humans would waste ammunition on long-range attacks that had no chance of penetrating their defenses. Grand Marshal Vekthar ordered his ships to maintain formation and wait for the humans to close to effective range. But the missiles were not meant to hit anything. They were meant to create data. Each one that was destroyed sent back telemetry about Velkhari targeting systems and response times. Human computers analyzed the information in microseconds. Kelly Price watched her tactical display as firing solutions updated continuously. The missiles had done their job. Now the real attack could begin. Helen ordered the battle group to split into 3 sections. 6 ships went high above the orbital plane. 6 went low. 6, including the Defiant, continued straight toward the Velkhari formation. The enemy ships tracked all 3 groups but seemed uncertain which posed the real threat. Their formation began to shift as commanders tried to cover multiple approach vectors simultaneously. It was a small hesitation, less than 20 seconds, but that was enough. The high group reached their position and fired a spread of kinetic penetrators. These were not sophisticated missiles with guidance systems. They were just dense metal rods accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. The Velkhari point defense systems were calibrated for tracking missiles. The penetrators moved too fast and had no guidance systems to lock onto. 3 of them struck Velkhari ships before the enemy could adjust. Shields that were designed to stop energy weapons and slow missiles did almost nothing against solid projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. The first Velkhari ship broke apart. Its crew of 300 died instantly as the penetrator punched through the vessel from bow to stern. The second ship lost its entire port side. Atmosphere vented into space along with half the crew. The third ship survived, but its main reactor went critical. The captain ordered evacuation, but only half the crew made it to escape pods before the reactor exploded. Grand Marshal Vekthar stared at his tactical display in disbelief. 3 ships destroyed in the opening exchange. The humans had not even closed to what the Velkhari considered combat range. He ordered his fleet to tighten formation and focus fire on the approaching human ships. 200 Velkhari vessels began firing in coordinated volleys. The space between the fleets lit up with energy weapons and missile trails. Helen watched the incoming fire and smiled without humor. The Velkhari were doing exactly what human doctrine predicted. They were firing in mass volleys designed to overwhelm shields through sheer volume. It worked well again. So opponents who fought the same way. But human ships were not designed like Velkhari ships. They were smaller and faster with more maneuverable drives. As the Velkhari barrage approached, the human vessels scattered. Each ship broke in a different direction at maximum acceleration. The Velkhari fire control systems tried to track them, but the targeting solutions were designed for opponents who maintained formation. The mass volley that should have destroyed several human ships instead hit empty space. A few shots connected, but human shields were concentrated and angled to deflect rather than absorb. 2 ships took minor damage. None were destroyed. The low group of human ships used the distraction to close distance. They came up from below the orbital plane where the Valkyrie formation was weakest. Lieutenant Greg Stevens commanded a destroyer called the Ranger in this group. He had studied historical naval battles from Earth's oceans. His favorite was an ancient battle where a smaller fleet had attacked from the sun to blind their enemies. He could not use the sun here, but he could use the planet's gravity well. Greg ordered his ship to dive toward the planet at full thrust. His crew protested that they were moving too fast, that the gravity would tear them apart if they got too close. Greg told them to trust the math. Human ships were built with stronger hulls and better inertial dampeners than Valkyrie vessels, because humans had tested their ships in harsher conditions. Earth's gravity was stronger than most civilized worlds. Human engineers built everything to survive worst-case scenarios. The Ranger skimmed through the upper atmosphere of Valkyrie Prime. The hull temperature spiked, but held. The ship's trajectory bent around the planet and shot back up toward the enemy formation from directly below. The Valkyrie ships above them could not fire without risking hits on their own homeworld. Greg's ship and the 5 others with him had a clear shot at the underside of the enemy formation, where shields were weakest. They fired everything. Missiles and kinetic rounds and energy weapons all launched in a coordinated barrage. At this range and angle, the Valkyrie could not miss being hit. 8 enemy ships took catastrophic damage. 5 more were severely damaged and broke formation. The underside of the Valkyrie defensive sphere collapsed as ships tried to maneuver away from the unexpected attack angle. Grand Marshal Vekthar realized with growing horror that his formation was failing. The humans were not fighting like any opponent he had faced before. They were not trading shots in orderly lines. They were moving constantly and attacking from unexpected angles. They were using the terrain of space itself as a weapon. His ships were more powerful individually, but the humans were fighting as a coordinated whole while his forces were reacting piecemeal. He ordered his fleet to abandon the defensive sphere and pursue the human ships. If they could catch the smaller vessels and bring their superior numbers to bear in close combat, then the advantage would shift. 200 Valkyrie ships broke formation and began chasing 18 human vessels. On paper, it should have been a slaughter. But the humans had planned for this too. Helen ordered all 3 groups to form up and run, not away from the Valkyrie fleet, but toward it at an angle. The human ships came together into a loose formation and accelerated directly across the face of the pursuing enemy. The Valkyrie ships turned to follow, but human vessels were faster. They stayed just ahead of the Valkyrie weapons range and forced the enemy to chase them in a long curve around the planet. Kelly Price understood what Helen was doing. They were stringing out the Valkyrie formation, making them chase in a long line instead of maintaining their numbers advantage. The fastest Valkyrie ships pulled ahead while the slower ones fell behind. What had been a unified fleet became a stretched-out procession of vessels spread across thousands of kilometers. The human formation suddenly split again. Half the ships, including the Defiant, pulled a hard turn and decelerated. The Valkyrie ships that had been chasing them shot past, unable to slow down quickly enough. In that moment, the humans turned the chase around. Now they were behind the leading edge of the Valkyrie fleet. Helen ordered all weapons to fire at the rearmost enemy ships. The lead Valkyrie vessels tried to turn back, but their momentum carried them forward. The middle section of their fleet tried to engage the humans, but found themselves taking fire from multiple angles. The rear section was cut off and outnumbered. Greg Stevens and his group came back around the planet for a second pass. They hit the confused Valkyrie middle section from below again. The Valkyrie fleet was no longer a fleet. It was a mob of individual ships trying to respond to threats from every direction. Captains issued conflicting orders. Some tried to retreat, some tried to press the attack, some tried to reform a defensive position. The lack of unified command turned their numbers into a liability. Ships collided trying to maneuver. Weapons fire from Valkyrie vessels hit other Valkyrie vessels as often as it hit humans. Grand Marshal Vekthar tried to restore order, but his communications were jammed by human electronic warfare. He could see his fleet falling apart on the tactical display, but could not coordinate a response. Individual ship captains were making their own decisions. Some were good decisions, some were terrible, but none of them were part of a unified strategy. Helen pressed the attack. Her battle group focused fire on damaged enemy vessels, finished the wounded before engaging fresh opponents. It was a brutal calculus, but it worked. Every Valkyrie ship destroyed was one less gun shooting back. The humans methodically eliminated enemy vessels one by one. The Valkyrie tried to mass fire, but could not coordinate their targeting. Human ships dodged and weaved while maintaining their own firing solutions. 3 hours into the battle, the Velkari formation was shattered. 60 of their ships were destroyed. Another 40 were damaged too badly to fight. The rest were scattered across the orbital space trying to regroup. Human losses were minimal. 2 ships had taken heavy damage and withdrawn. 1 destroyer had been destroyed with most of its crew evacuated. The exchange rate was devastating. Grand Marshal Vekthar finally accepted what his tactical board was showing him. His fleet was beaten, not defeated in an honorable engagement, but systematically dismantled by an opponent that fought with a ruthlessness he had never imagined. He opened a channel to all Velkari ships and ordered them to cease fire and withdraw. Some captains obeyed. Others kept fighting out of pride or desperation. Helen gave them one chance to surrender. Those who took it were allowed to leave. Those who kept fighting were destroyed. The Galactic Council reconvened 3 days after the Battle of Velkari Prime. The chamber was quieter than anyone could remember. Representatives sat in their sections without the usual chatter and negotiations that preceded formal sessions. Everyone had seen the reports. The Velkari fleet had been destroyed. Not defeated or damaged, but effectively eliminated as a fighting force. Across 24 star systems, human battle groups had executed their missions with brutal efficiency. The species that had ruled this sector for 4 centuries no longer had a military capable of defending its own territory. Daniel Cooper entered the chamber with Lisa Grant beside him. He looked exactly as he had 3 days earlier, calm and composed. His uniform was pressed and perfect. His expression showed neither triumph nor regret. He walked to the human delegation section and stood waiting for the session to begin. Other representatives watched him with expressions ranging from fear to respect to barely concealed anger. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted and everyone knew it. Chairman Krath called the session to order. His bioluminescent patterns flickered nervously between colors. He had held this position for 15 cycles and prided himself on maintaining order and dignity in council proceedings. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for this situation. A young species had just destroyed the fleet of an established power. The rules that had governed galactic relations for generations suddenly seemed fragile and inadequate. Ambassador Korath was not present. He had resigned his position the day after the battle and returned to the Velkari homeworld. In his place sat a junior diplomat named Threx who looked like he wished he was anywhere else. Threx activated his translator and spoke in a voice that shook slightly. He said that the Velkari Dominion accepted all terms of the human ultimatum. They would surrender the fleet commanders who had ordered the attacks on human colonies. They would submit to war crimes tribunals. They would accept monitoring stations in their territory. They would reduce their remaining military to defensive patrol craft only. Daniel nodded but did not smile. He told Threx that humanity accepted the Velkari surrender. The commanders would be transported to a neutral facility within 1 week. Human monitoring stations would be operational within 1 month. Any Velkari military vessel larger than a patrol craft would be dismantled or turned over to human custody. These were not negotiable terms. They were the price of the Velkari's betrayal. A representative from the Thaxian collective stood up. His name was Drex, and he had been vocal in questioning human capabilities before the battle. Now his tone was different. He asked Daniel what humanity planned to do with its newfound military dominance, whether they intended to expand their territory, whether other species should fear human aggression. His questions were polite, but the concern behind them was obvious. Daniel turned to face Drex directly. He said that humanity had no interest in conquest or empire building. They had not wanted this war. They had not sought to prove their military strength. The Velkari had forced this situation by murdering human civilians and breaking a peace treaty. Humanity had responded with exactly enough force to ensure it would never happen again. Nothing more and nothing less. He paused and then added that any other species considering similar actions should take note of what had happened to the Velkari. The chamber remained silent. Daniel continued speaking. He said that humanity had come to the stars hoping to find peaceful partners. They had signed treaties in good faith. They had accepted unfavorable terms to prove their peaceful intentions. And when those gestures were met with violence, they had shown what they were truly capable of. He wanted the council to understand something important. Human restraint was not weakness. Human preference for diplomacy was not inability to fight. Humanity could be the best friend or the worst enemy any species ever had. The choice of which they became was up to others. Lisa stepped forward and activated a display. It showed deployment schedules for human forces. Battle groups were already withdrawing from Velkari space. They were returning to standard patrol routes. The massive show of force that had surrounded Velkari worlds was being reduced to a single monitoring fleet. Humanity was demonstrating that it meant what Daniel said. They had no interest in occupation or permanent military presence. Their goal had been justice, not territory. A representative from a small species called the Renvi asked a practical question. What would happen to the Velkari now? Their fleet was destroyed. Their economy was in chaos. Their government was unstable. Would humanity help them rebuild or leave them vulnerable to other predators? It was a legitimate concern. The galaxy had species that would see the weakened Velkari as an opportunity. Daniel had anticipated this question. He said that humanity would guarantee Velkari security for the next 10 years. Any species that attempted to take advantage of their weakened state would face the same response the Velkari themselves had faced. Human monitoring stations would serve dual purposes. They would ensure the Velkari kept their commitments and they would protect Velkari territory from external threats. After 10 years, the situation would be reevaluated. If the Velkari had honored their agreements and demonstrated peaceful intentions, human forces would withdraw completely. This surprised many in the council. They had expected humanity to either abandon the Velkari or establish permanent control. Daniel's approach was different. Punishment but also protection. Accountability but also opportunity for redemption. It was a more nuanced response than most galactic conflicts produced. Wars usually ended with the loser either destroyed or subjugated. Humanity was offering a third option. Chairman Krath asked if there were any objections to the terms Daniel had outlined. No one spoke. Even species that might have protested under normal circumstances remained silent. The Battle of Velkari Prime had made it clear that objecting to human demands came with significant risks. The terms were harsh but fair. The Velkari had committed atrocities and were being held accountable. That was more justice than most species bothered to pursue. The formal treaty was drafted over the following week. Daniel reviewed every clause with the attention to detail that had made him one of humanity's best diplomats. This treaty would set precedents that lasted for generations. It needed to be clear and enforceable. No room for misinterpretation or future betrayal. Lisa worked beside him through long nights, making sure the military provisions were practical and could be monitored effectively. The signing ceremony took place 2 weeks after the battle. Threk signed for the Velkari with hands that shook. Daniel signed for humanity with steady confidence. Chairman Krath witnessed the document along with representatives from a dozen neutral species. The treaty was transmitted across the galaxy. Every civilized world received a copy. Everyone would know what had happened here. Everyone would remember. Helen Morris attended the ceremony in her dress uniform. She had received commendations from Earth Command for her actions during the battle. But standing in the council chamber, she felt no pride or satisfaction. She had done her duty and done it well. 372 human crew members had died under her command. She remembered every name. The victory had been necessary, but it was not something to celebrate. Greg Stevens stood with her. His hair had more gray in it than it had 2 weeks ago. He had personally destroyed 6 Velkari ships during the battle. Each one had carried hundreds of crew members. He told himself they had been given chances to surrender. That he had followed the rules of engagement. That their deaths were on the Velkari commanders who had refused to cease fire. But knowing he had done the right thing did not make it easier to sleep at night. Daniel finished signing the documents and stepped back. He looked out at the assembled council and saw fear in many eyes. That bothered him more than he let show. Humanity did not want to be feared. They wanted to be respected and trusted. But trust had to be earned, and the galaxy had learned that humanity could not be taken advantage of. Perhaps in time the fear would fade and trust could be rebuilt. For now, this was enough. Lisa asked him quietly if he thought the treaty would hold. Daniel considered the question carefully. He said that this treaty would hold because everyone now understood the cost of breaking it. The Velkari had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Other species had learned it by watching. Fear was not the foundation he wanted for peace, but it was better than war. They left the council chamber together. Outside the windows of Zenith Prime Station, the stars shone with the same light they always had. But something fundamental had changed. Humanity had proven itself on the galactic stage, not as victims or junior partners, but as equals who demanded respect. The galaxy would adjust to this new reality. Some species would become closer allies, knowing that humanity kept its word and defended its friends. Others would keep their distance, uncertain what to make of this fierce young species. Daniel did not care what other species thought, as long as they left human colonies alone. He had not become a diplomat to make friends. He had become a diplomat to protect his people, and he had just demonstrated that he would use any tool available to accomplish that mission. Diplomacy when possible, force when necessary. The galaxy had seen both now. He thought about the 73,000 people who had died in the Velkari attacks. The treaty would not bring them back. Nothing would. But perhaps their deaths had bought something valuable. A galaxy that understood humanity would not accept being victims. A future where treaties were honored because the cost of breaking them was too high. A chance for real peace built on mutual respect rather than convenient lies. It was not the peace he had hoped for when he first came to the stars. But it was the peace that was possible now. And Daniel Cooper had learned long ago to work with what was possible rather than what was perfect.